Thank you so much for joining me today for a conversation about our grandmothers. And I feel like this has been a conversation that's been a long time coming because we talk about our grandmothers all the time in passing. And I've been just watching you as you've evolved over the years and watching you with Emma's legacy and your family and the way you guys have just lifted up your grandmother's story. And I'm so interested in that because I was reading recently about the role of grandmothers in the family and how there is a void of conversation or even a canon around the leadership of grandmothers and how we center it on men in the family.
Mm,
And I thought about myself because Mother Odell and Mother Betty, those two women were at the foundation of everything that I am. But I talk about my grandfather more often than I talk about my grandmother. And I
mm.
think it kind of is because my grandmother passed away when I was 22. And then I had a long time with my grandfather by himself. And I lived with him for a while and I got to spend time with him and get to know him. So what do you remember as the beginning of your relationship with your grandmother?
I love this question so much and this conversation so much because my grandmother used to pull me into her bedroom
Mhm.
on Friday night, Saturday night when we would spend the night. And all the grandchildren were down there, or it was
Mhm.
usually several of us at one time spending the night. So my cousins or my siblings are out there playing or just hanging out. And I'm in my grandmother's bedroom and she is got the Sunday school book, the old school little booklets that
Yeah.
had the questions and the prompts. So we're raising up leaders. So to have the students have some portion of this service where we're participating in the educational aspect of it. And so for me, or what the other students were doing was they would just have their book, they would read the little, message at the
Mhm.
beginning, they would read the scripture, then they
Oh,
would ask the questions. And Emma Jane Baxley said,
yes.
no, you need to have some supplemental material.
Yeah.
Now, that's not the language that
Yeah.
she used,
Yeah.
but basically that's what she was doing. She had the one of those study Bibles that, if it was like Job 4 and 7,
Mhm.
next to it in the margins, it had like, here are all the other places where this is talked about in the Bible. So you could go to Ezekiel, you could go to, so that's what my grandmother expected of me. Go to these other places, have at least one other scripture that you can take people to so that it's not just, this is the lesson.
Mhm.
What else do you think about this? And she would ask me, what do you think about this? And
Mhm.
I'm sitting there like, but I remember this so vividly because when I got older and my work was around curriculum development, I was like, wait a minute, my
Yes.
grandmother literally, she definitely did not have the language of curriculum development. But she definitely was instilling in me, have some supplemental materials. What's your facts, examples, details, and specifics? Have some additional prompts. What do you think about this so that you can also lead that into the conversation? Make it interesting. So that is honestly one of my earliest memories of my relationship with my grandmother, and it pretty much remains steady in that regard for the rest of my life with her.
I wish I had something that sounded as smart as that because I don't. Because my earliest memories of my time with Grandma Odell involved me and my cousin Nikki, and we lived in the neighborhood, and the town was small. So even if you lived far from your grandparents, you lived close to them. But we lived right. Nikki lived across the
Hmm.
fence. I lived right next door. We shared the same driveway, and we would spend all of our afternoons at our grandparents' house. Our grandmother was so meticulous about her
Hmm.
house. We didn't have a lot,
Uh-huh.
but she was like, this house needs to be presentable because there were so many people always
Hmm.
coming to the house. It was just, it felt like people were always coming over to visit her and talk to my grandfather about something. But I remember her taking great pride in being a host and being hospitable and having cultivated a gathering place not only for our family, but also for people from church, people from
Hmm.
the community. Even though I don't think of my grandmother as being super engaged with me in a direct way, I was all up in her space, all up in her business, and it was more passive. But I think about us in the way that our circles were congruent in Sandusky. We went to different churches, but I always think about the things that formulated me and your grandmother and your godmother who lived across the street. Like,
Hmm.
what was that like? Just being able to be so fluid with them.
My grandmother is not a like, she never really operated like a grandmother,
Mhm.
honestly. I feel like because so my grandmother never lived in that house by herself.
Mhm.
Even once her children left home, then Dennis lived with her, my oldest guy cousin, and then somebody was always there with her. And I don't know if that was ever articulated, if that was the plan, but
Mhm.
that's just the way that it worked. And I don't, to the point that I don't even remember at which point I was tapped in that
Mhm.
now, like, it's your turn. You going to live with grandma or you going to stay with grandma long term. But it never felt like that. She always felt like a mother and a friend, not even like a grandmother, honestly.
Really?
Like my grandmother was so cool. I mean, she was very stern and serious.
Yeah.
You know this. My
Yeah.
grandmother was the head usher on the usher board, on the motherboard,
At every church.
at every single funeral, at every single,
Yes.
she was going to tend to the things. But at home, my grandma was silly. My grandma was funny. My grandma was shady. My grandma was petty. My grandmother was the kind of woman who would get out of the shower, wrap her towel around her, and walk through the house. Like, now she's supposed to be trying to be unassuming,
Mhm.
but she would,
Mhm.
like, she was just silly all the time, and so that is the way that I largely experienced her growing up, and I feel like when you say the language, like, what did it feel like being so fluid in that regard, particularly as it pertains to my grandmother, that she went from being this person who was introducing me to, like,
Mhm.
education and the depths of that,
Mhm.
to simultaneously being this person who really taught me just the power of a side eye or the power
Mhm.
of, like, of wittiness, because my grandmother was so witty, and having she actually is not my godmother officially, but she's my grandmother's best
Mhm.
friend, but we all called her
Mhm.
godmommy. Having her right across the street is also this other older Southern woman who was very jazzy
Mhm.
and witty. She never drove herself. Her husband always took her everywhere she wanted to go. She always had something snarky, something. So me growing up to be this kind of like witty, straight-faced,
Mhm.
intelligent, but kinda shady sometimes woman, it makes sense when I think about sometimes my mom will be like, "I wanna be mad at you, but I know you got that from my mama."
Yeah.
Like, I
Yeah.
wanna be mad about this right now, but yeah, so my cousin Jamie, she's like the way that she exists in the world, I remember asking her one day, like, "Why are you like this?" And she was like, "Do you realize that I grew up my best friends were old women named Ida, Emma, and
Ab
Annie?"
absolutely.
So,
Absolutely. My
it
grandmother's best friends were my
yeah,
friends.
these are my friends.
Yeah.
Mine was probably Miss Classy, my grandmother,
Miss
Miss
Classic
Ivy
used to
Mae.
get me together, and they'll be like, "It wasn't even me."
Don't matter. Those are my besties. So yeah, you grew up with old Southern Black women
Mhm.
who maybe don't take themselves as serious as what we
Mhm.
probably expect from that age group all the time. It really, I know for sure I don't get to be this version of myself without that type of,
Mhm.
upbringing with those types of women.
I feel like we are so blessed to have had that because not only did I have that with my grandmother and her sisters and her friends and her cousins, because my grandmother's first cousins. It's funny to me that I'm really close to my first cousins. They're like my siblings.
Hmm.
My grandmother was like that with her first
Hmm.
cousins. So a lot of them, I always thought they were her siblings.
Hmm.
But we're so blessed because every single thing I am at my core comes from the seasoning of those elder women. From your grandmother to my grandmother to Mrs. Newell, like the people that
Hmm.
in the extension of elder women at our school and in our community who worked with us. And being from a small town and the civicness in our small town, I feel like we got the best of both worlds. Like I always think, man, I wish I would have grew up in a city. I used to think that, but now that I'm older, I'm like, we got substantive training.
I have this revelation in waves
Hmm.
when I get to know other people and learn more about their upbringing. I'm like, there was, of course, frustration because very
Hmm.
similarly, my siblings and my cousins, they were like my brother cousins, my
Hmm.
sister cousins. Like there wasn't really a line in like, this is my cousin and that is
Right.
totally separate. Of course, we understood ourselves as separate, but at some point, we all kind of lived at grandma's house together. You
Right.
sleep in this bed, you come in, some of the larger arguments of my life was at that house trying to figure out, I already made up this bed. You can't sleep in this bed. You need to go sleep upstairs. So I grew up with the understanding of belonging that is very different from what a lot of people grew up. And so I have I experience that now as a privilege and not just as that was just my experience. No, like it was a privilege to have grown up understanding what it means really to have all things in common. And then beyond that though, when I also talk about like how do I when I introduced the language of fourth wave womanism
Mhm,
and I defined it as this socio-political spiritual religious tool, it makes sense that I would have this as a part of the ethic of the way that I exist in the world
mhm,
because of the way that I was raised in a
mhm,
very socio-political, like you said, the civic mindedness. It was a part of our being. You know,
mhm,
Reverend Eddie and Henry, the pastor of the church that I grew up in, who had only been to Africa once, but made that really such a part of the way that he existed in the world, thinking about global blackness, thinking about it even in certain traditions that didn't require us to be talking about, you know, what is black about this.
mhm.
Pastor Henry or, you know, Minister Marietta, Jesus
Yeah.
Johnson, thank
Mhm,
you. You know, these people who were a part of the Christian education there who were saying, and we're also talking about what it means to be black in this experience.
mhm.
And that is so rare. I have found that from so many of my friends that either had one and not the other, or didn't have either, or had some version of it, but it wasn't as the depth of it that we experienced growing up just wasn't the same. So I absolutely experience it as a privilege now.
I don't think that my grandmother or like even sometimes and other people in our family will realize how demonstrative her leadership was for us and her guidance was for us. And when I think back to how I formulated, like just even the simplest of ideas,
Hmm.
being at my grandmother's house, watching her,
Hmm.
from her calling me to come over on Sunday morning and help her get her foundations buttoned up, or being there just moving around in the house when she was watching Guiding Light, and then my whole life. And then when I got to be a junior in high school, I decided to go to Venezuela. Why? Because on Guiding Light, they did all of their business in Venezuela.
For sure.
So when you think about you, first of all, I'm so fascinated because we both come from large families, but I come from a family of men. You come from a family of women.
Hmm.
And I'm interested in how you see like the casting of your grandmother on you and your girl cousins.
I think we all have some element of my grandmother's personality. You could see it in a facial expression that
Hmm.
Trina will make, or, you know, something that Jamie will say that's just hilarious or very old. Ma'am, you are not 90. You
Hmm.
actually can talk like you're in your 30s. Uh, and and Lynette, you know, which is my oldest sister, it is my grandmother on
Hmm.
most days. Like, or I remember right after my grandmother transitioned, I was in school in Berkeley, California at the time. I'm sitting at this Mexican restaurant eating, and I looked down at my hands and just started sobbing because I was like, Emma Jane, not you done left me your hands.
Hmm.
Like and the same thing with my mom. Sometimes I'll go hold my mom's hand and it'll just feel like what it felt like to
Hmm.
hold my grandmother's hand. Or, you know, my Aunt Phyllis, you know, just different little wisdoms that she'll share. My Aunt Viola, different stories that she'll tell that sounds like the way that my grandmother used to story tell. It's like all of the pieces of all of us. I remember when my grandmother transitioned, Miss Diane Hayes came up
Hmm.
to me at the funeral, and, so all the granddaughters were receiving people at the
Hmm.
funeral. Miss Diane Hayes walked up to me, and she's crying, and she said, "I'm so sorry for your loss," and I said, "I'm so sorry for your loss," and she, like, jerked back, and she was like, "Thank you for saying that." And I talked to her about it
Hmm.
later, but she was ultimately like, sometimes when people pass, the family is so central that you just trying to contain yourself to not really feel your feelings
Hmm.
about what's happening.
Hmm.
But to understand that my grandmother also belonged to you.
Right.
My grandmother also belonged to Miss Diane Hayes. My grandmother also belonged to my best friend, you know, just some of her age mates, or some people that were much older, some people that didn't have anything to do with that household, but that her residue, or she left her energy, she left her spirit.
Yeah.
It was so profound that I see it even in, you know, there some of my closest friends still say things that like
Hmm.
my I'm done with this sermon, but my girlfriend Nikki Black often says, and she'll say, and that's a credit to Miss Emma Jane Baxter. And I love that my grandmother's spirit has, you know, both while she was in this flesh and now even through her memory or the way that we talk about her, like we enflesh her literally,
Yeah.
or, you know, in our language or in our behavior on an ongoing basis.
Did you know what you had in your grandmother when you were growing up? Did you know the quality of cultivation that was happening for you to be there and have that. Because a lot of times, we think of grandparents in a very generic way, but to have relationship with them where they're in your daily life and they're formulating you as much as your parents, that is a privilege.
I don't think that I knew the way that I have these moments of, even as a teenager, that I do have like a clear moment of like, oh, my grandmother really is her. So I have those kinds of moments, but I couldn't intellect how profound my grandmother would be on my life until my 20s, when my grandmother's health started to decline in my mid to late 20s. And I'm so grateful that, whether it was like morbid or not, whatever reason I connected to it, something in me said, you better love your grandma. And so, but when my grandmother's health first started to fail, or when it first started to decline, I immediately just had this something click in me that was just like, this is my bestie. Like, this is my best friend. And that is I have, as a matter of fact, a little song.
Yeah.
Grandmother, you are my very best friend. I have to sing it to her all the time. That was my bestie. So now, me, Lynette, me and my sisters were the only ones that weren't there when my grandmother transitioned. Everybody else was there, including my mom. Everybody else was there around my grandmother's bed when she was leaving this body. And I had like such a deep peace that my best friend rode the bus from New York thinking that she was going to have to come hold me together. She was like, yeah, you cried at the funeral, but I expected you to get over in that casket based on the way that you are about your grandmother. And it is because I was so crystal clear in my early 20s before my grandmother transitioned. I need to give her everything I got, and I need to get everything she got. And I feel like we did it.
I remember when you went back to Sandusky
Uh-huh.
and lived with her, and I just was so envious because I felt like probably around 14 or 15 when I knew it was almost time for me to leave for college. And I thought, I'm going to leave for college and I'm not coming back.
Huh.
So I was thinking, let me soak up all of this right now. But I think I was just obsessed with my grandparents.
Yeah, you were not envious of me being in Sandusky because we used to have a code
Right,
word. If I ever
right.
call you and tell you I'm moving back to Sandusky,
I wasn't
I've been
envious of
kidnapped.
that, but I was envious of the
The
prolonged
time.
amount of time that you had, and that there was intentional
Mm-hmm.
time that you were able to spend, because that's studying time and
Mm-hmm.
that's imprinting time.
Mm-hmm.
And it is something to be envious of. I am
Mm-hmm.
careful how I talk about my grandparents with my cousins, because I don't want it to seem like I have this,
Uh-huh.
because this is a treasure.
Mm-hmm.
My memories with my grandparents are my greatest treasure. I don't have anything greater than that. And when I talk about it, I'm careful not to bask too hard, because it's hard when you don't have those memories.
Uh-huh. That's very beautiful. I'm not careful to not bask. And it's not
Yeah.
even gloating. It is such a treasure to me
Hmm.
that I feel like there are other places in my life where I've watered down like how big of a deal this is.
Yeah.
And I feel like when it comes to my grandmother and the experiences that I've had with her, I don't even get to exist. Like, I'm not even smart.
Hmm.
I don't, this lady was teaching me to develop curriculum at 6, right? So everything that I am, I can't, I have these moments where I feel whatever's happening in the room as I'm talking about my grandmother in this way, even maybe as it pertains to my mom. And it's not a slight to anybody or shade to anybody. It is the greatest thing that ever happened to me, right? One of the best things that ever happened to me is that Emma Jane Baxley, I'll tell this story. I have my great grandmother, my grandmother's mother, Minnie
Hmm.
Bell Lee, has several children. They were sharecroppers. Her and her husband were sharecroppers. They have several children. Children. My grandmother isn't the oldest or the youngest. She's not the oldest daughter or the youngest daughter. She's somewhere in the middle. And some arbitrary defining, my great grandmother, Minnie Bell Lee, looked at my grandmother and said, Emma Jane cannot pick cotton. She got to go to school.
Hmm.
So my grandmother is the only one of her siblings to go to school.
Wow.
And from my great grandparents' lineage, the family tree, there is something very particular that every single one of Emma Jane's children went to school.
Mm,
Every single one of Emma Jane's grandchildren went to school, to the point that now it is, I don't even think we celebrate it the way
mhm,
that we used to, because it's just an expectation. Of
mhm,
course, you will go to school. And then even most of us have pursued higher education or some type of, additional education. And I say that in this moment to say, my grandmother, both from the ancestral, both backwards and forwards, there's something so special about her. What was it about her as a little girl? It's got to be all hands on deck when it comes to sharecropping. And for some reason, they looked at her and said, Emma Jane cannot, she cannot pick cotton. She got to
mhm,
go to school. So to honor that as like a big of a deal as whatever Minnie Bell Lee saw about my grandmother, I think her daughters saw that about her,
mhm.
and her grandchildren certainly feel that about her, saw that about her, feel that about her still in this moment. And so to water it down by being like, sorry you didn't have that
Mhm,
experience. You should have went
mhm.
over there.
That is so funny. So when you think about, carrying on the legacy, what inspired you to start Emma's Legacy?
My grandmother used to call every single one of the grandchildren before we went to school and pray with us.
Mhm,
At some point, because it's too many of us, it used to be like, you call this person on three way, you call this person on three way, you call this person. But every single morning before we went to school, my grandmother would call us. And so in 2011, when my grandmother was still alive at the time, in 2011, I was going through a really big depression. And I was just thinking, God, what am I gonna do? How am I going to survive this? I don't know how I'm gonna survive this. And I thought about the way that my grandmother used to call and pray for us.
mm,
Whatever was happening for me, somehow the Spirit of God was revealing to me that my grandmother wasn't just calling to pray for us just because she loved us so much. Of course, she loved us, but also because it was something that satisfied her soul. It
mhm,
was something that sustained her. It was something that really, um, this is a single woman for the majority of her adult life at this point, because my grandfather died when my mom was a little girl. So
mhm,
this lady spent the rest of her life, for the most part, being single. And so what satisfies her? What brings her joy? What is somehow God was giving me this in 2011, like prayer. She wasn't just praying just because she loved us. She was also praying because it was doing something for her. So I started to pray for people. Like
mhm,
I had a friend prayer call. I had my family prayer
mhm.
call.
You
And
call me on my birthday and pray for
yeah,
me?
honey, I'm gonna pray just to make it today. And that, when it really, really kicked in for me, that's where I came to the language of like, oh, this actually is Emma's legacy. This prayer, this, being able to really petition God on behalf of somebody else, and to like remove myself even from the situation, how much it was maturing me, how much it was cultivating me, but also how it was bringing me joy and ease in this season of grief. And so that's where I came to the language of Emma's legacy. But then once I started saying it out loud, then my family was like, "Oh, that's so beautiful." Lynette started the Emma's legacy family. It's kind of
Mhm,
like, but it was while my grandmother was alive still, we started meeting like a family reunion kind of situation
mhm,
to honor her. But instead of calling it a family reunion, it really was about honoring my grandmother and her legacy, which wasn't just us. The community would come
mhm.
sometimes, other people would come sometimes. And also, then we are sharing like, what are the things that are so profound about my grandmother? These things are Emma's legacy.
Yeah, so I would say that my grandmother's mantra with our family was stay together. And she was very serious about her kids getting together with her and grandpa for dinner often. Like we got together all the time. Like Sundays, Saturdays, we would go to the park. All year round, we got together. And I remember growing up how people used to criticize us so much like, y'all don't even have separate lives. You guys are so enmeshed. And now I'm so fascinated because those very people who criticized it, I see them now trying to bring their families together.
Uh-huh.
And I won't say it's easy for us now because we've gotten so large with the children and
Hmm.
grandchildren, but it's like a muscle that my
Hmm.
grandmother she developed in us, and so we get together the same way. And I appreciate that because if you don't have some rooting somewhere, which is
Hmm.
what my grandmother was trying to do, was just give us some rooting so that you can stand. I'm finding myself more and more in my family,
Hmm.
not in my education, not in my professional
Okay.
pursuits.
Hmm.
What do you feel like, you know, in what you're pursuing in the future? How is that threading back to the leadership of your grandmother?
I think I have thought about like the hierarchy or the institution of my family,
Mhm.
and that there's a hierarchy of eldership at some point. So it's whatever my grandmother gave us,
Mhm.
right? And then from oldest to youngest, and the older you were, that is this the hierarchy of eldership. And then the lower you are on the totem pole, the least kind of power say so you have. Now there are ways to move it out of your rank. You could have some financial success
Mhm.
or influence. So that means that you are supporting the family in some way, largely. So I feel like I had an aunt that kind of wasn't in her lane, but was a little higher because of
Mhm.
her social and economic standing. And you could rebel a little bit.
Mm.
Hit me to the extent, maybe a few things. Also, some success. So I get to say my grandmother's name louder maybe than anybody else does because of the platforms that I built. It gives me a little bit, not a lot, because the rebellion piece, that's a podcast for a different day. But that to say, what I feel like my grandmother did very well was that she was crystal clear in whatever it was that she was giving us.
Mhm.
That now here we are generations later, and her great grandchildren got to help her while she was, even when her health was failing. So they were a part of that. So we're now what 5 generations at that point then in this family's lineage from Minnie Bell Lee down to Siani.
Mhm.
We're 5 generations into like, okay, we belong to each other. We have to continue to make sure that we support each other in these ways. That's that. What I feel like my role is with my slight rebellion and also with the way that I show up in the hierarchy of eldership is something that Minnie Bell Lee actually saw in Emma Jane that she wanted for the future.
Mhm.
Like I don't think that I am the highest imagination of my ancestors, but I think that I am a high imagination of my ancestors. And so whatever Minnie Bell Lee saw in Emma Jane, whatever Emma Jane saw when she pulled me into that room, to teach me that curriculum, that it is my responsibility to be imagining something even more profound
Yes.
for Siani, for the young people that haven't even been born yet. Should I have children at some point out of my body, that I need to make sure that I'm doing whatever it is that I'm supposed to be doing in this family and in our community, to the extent that by the time the next generation or generations come, that they're able to look back and both understand how we got here, this
Mhm.
lineage, so keeping that alive, but also that I have imagined something profound. And I think that I'm doing that in my family. I think about the fact that Minnie Bell Lee was a sharecropper,
Mhm.
and she looked at Emma Jane and said, Emma Jane can't pick cotton. She got to go to school. And I do take some liberty to assume that she was thinking about me.
I appreciate this time with you, and every time we get to have a conversation that's formal, it's so edifying because I imagined that we would be at this point one day, but to be at this point, it makes me feel goosebumps about it. But where can people find you?
My name is EbonyJanice. I go by EbonyJanice, which means that you should call me EbonyJanice, and you can find me everywhere pretty much at EbonyJanice.
And what's your website?
EbonyJanice.com.
Thank you, Ebony Denise. Thank you. Follow me on all social media platforms. I'm just Catress Mine. And also check out my website of sistren.com. And I'll see you next time.